I'm the storyteller, and my stories must be told. I have many stories, tales for both the young and old. I have many voices to describe many places. Many names have I, and many faces. In Russia I am Ivan, in Sweden I am Jan. In Germany I'm Johann, in America I'm John. From my many travels I have gathered these tales to teach you good sense when all else fails. Sometimes there are tears, sometimes there is laughter, but always are happily ever after.
Long ago and far away, there was once a prince called Kusa, who lived in a fine palace. Kusa's father ruled his people wisely and well, and under him his kingdom prospered. But although the people were happy, Kusa was not. Good and wise though he was, he suffered from one slight affliction. He had a small scar on his left cheek. It wasn't very bad, but in Kusa's mind it was a horrible disfigurement, and because of this he had vowed that he would never inflict his ugliness on a bride, so he had never married. This state of affairs, however, did not suit his father the king, and each day he would summon Kusa to his council chamber and advise him, "My son, you must marry. Choose a princess from one of the many kingdoms which surround us, so that you will have a family of your own, and I shall know that when I die, the kingdom will still be ruled by my heirs." Although the king knew of his son's feelings, he continued to insist that somewhere Kusa would find a bride who would make him happy, despite his scar. "You will always look as you do, my son," he urged, "but a wise woman will love your kind and generous heart, not your face." He refused to listen to Kusa's protests anymore. The prince's heart was very heavy. He knew that his father was right, but who could he choose? He didn't really want to marry anybody who couldn't love him for himself, and who could love a prince who wasn't perfect. As he brooded on this problem, he suddenly thought of a plan which would keep his father happy, and yet it would not be necessary for him to marry, for Kusa was a talented artist, well known for his fine likenesses of the courtiers. The portrait he now painted was of a beautiful imaginary princess, and he told his father, "I shall marry the princess who most resembles this painting, or I marry nobody." He didn't really believe there lived a princess so lovely. The king realized what Kusa's plan was, but he was determined for his part that his son would marry. And so he instructed his most trustworthy messengers to scour all the kingdoms of the land and not to return home until they found the princess who most resembled the painting. And when they found her, she was to be brought home as Kusa's bride. After months of weary searching, they arrived at last at the kingdom of Mada, for they had heard that this king had 4 beautiful daughters, who lived in the most perfect of all the palaces they had visited. All the courtiers took just one look at the portrait, and everyone exclaimed how like it was to the king's eldest daughter, the Princess Prabhavati. Everyone was delighted. the messengers because their long search was finally over, the king of Madder because someone as rich and powerful as Prince Kusa wanted to marry his daughter. Without any further delay, the messengers were instructed to return to their master to tell him the happy news, while Pabhavati and her sisters prepared her perfect trousseau for the perfect marriage. Kusa's father was overjoyed at the news, for he had never thought his messengers would find such a lovely princess. And when they told him that she was as gentle as she was beautiful, his cup was full. But how was he to persuade his reluctant son to take this girl as his bride? The king was well versed in the law of his country, and after much careful study of ancient decrees, he came across the record of a very old custom. He summoned Kusa to meet him on his favourite terrace. This law, he explained to his son, stated that the bride of a prince was not permitted to observe the face of her husband until the first year of their marriage was complete. The prince's face always had to be veiled, and, moreover, the couple could only meet alone in a darkened room. "Let us revive this decree for your marriage," the king advised Kusa. "For 1 year, the princess will see for herself what a wise and just ruler you are, and she will learn to love you for yourself, not for your looks." Although Kusa doubted that this ruse would work, he had to keep his side of the bargain. So, without any further delay, the messengers were sent to bring Pabhavati to her new home. All the courtiers and citizens dressed in their finest to welcome their new princess. Her first sight of the kingdom deeply impressed her with this show of pomp and wealth. And because she was Kusa's chosen bride, everyone received her with much rejoicing. Her new father-in-law was overjoyed to see that his messengers had not exaggerated her beauty, and gladly greeted her as his daughter. While Pabhavati, for her part, was delighted with everything she saw of her new home. The only strange feature was that her new husband was fully veiled. Right through the wedding ceremony, she saw nothing of his face whatsoever. Strange countries have strange customs, she told herself, expecting that when they were alone, her husband would take off that heavy veil. Much to her astonishment, she soon learnt that in fact he would remain veiled for a full year. They would only meet in a darkened room, and her husband insisted on concealing himself behind a screen while he played his sitar. Each day she longed more and more to see his face. She had heard much about his generosity and his wisdom. Surely, she thought, my husband's face must be as perfect as his voice. Oh, if only I could see what he really looks like. Her impatience grew, and with it her pleading to Kusa to unveil himself for her. But the prince was adamant, insisting that they obey the law to the letter in this matter. "But my dearest, you will find time pass very quickly," he assured her. But apart from this one prohibition, Kusa gave her everything she asked for, and more. But Pabhavati's curiosity had reached fever pitch, and she decided that by hook or by crook she would see her husband's face. She had heard that he was to lead an important religious procession through the city streets, and, as was his usual custom, he would give alms to the poor. This gave her the opportunity she was waiting for. She had little doubt he would be as perfect as she herself was. Knowing how much her maid coveted one of her necklaces, she bribed the girl to hide her at a secret vantage point where she would have a clear view of Kusa's face as he rode by in the procession. As she watched the eager crowds below her, nobody could have waited more anxiously for the prince than she. As she crouched there, she daydreamed pleasantly about Kusa's handsome face and the thrill she would have in seeing it just this once. As the royal guard marched by, she thought, surely my husband who leads all these men is 10 times more handsome than they. And her heart leapt as she heard the royal trumpets give their fanfare in the distance, and as the crowd's cheers grew louder and louder. At last, Prince Kusa and his entourage must be approaching. Eagerly, she leant over the parapet as the royal elephant came into view, so that she could catch her first glimpse of her husband. There he was, bending down to give alms to the poor. She stared eagerly. Then shrank back in shock. He was handsome, but he was far from perfect. "This can't be Kusa," she cried. I have been cruelly deceived indeed. How could my father let me marry such a man? And how can I continue to be married to someone who looks like that?" She rushed to her apartments and ordered her servant to pack all her possessions and order her litter. She was not remaining in this luckless kingdom for a minute longer than necessary. In the evening, Kusa wondered why Pabhavati kept him waiting for their usual meeting when he would sing to her. But when her maid, appalled at what had happened that day, told him that his wife had fled because she could no longer live with him, his grief knew no bounds. He had fallen deeply in love with Pabhavati, with her beauty and her gentleness, and he realized that, ugly though he was, he could not live without her. "If Pabhavati will not stay with me, then I shall go and see if I can be near her," he thought sadly. The Princess Pabhavati had gone back to her father's palace, and each evening she and her sisters would sit in the garden to enjoy the fragrance of the flowers and the cool evening breeze. Disguised as a poor peasant and carrying only his precious sitar, Kusa had arrived in the kingdom of Mada. One dusk, the princesses were ravished with the sweet sound of a sitar, tinkling like a fountain in the cool air. Never had the sisters heard anything quite so moving. But when Pabhavati heard that well-known melody, her heart sank. Kusa has followed me to take me back with him against my will, she thought indignantly. How dare he? I shan't go. Much to her sister's astonishment, she ordered the palace guards to get rid of the intruder who was disturbing their evening peace. But even after silence was restored, somehow Pabhavati didn't feel as happy as she ought. Her father saw how unhappy she was and kept devising entertainments for her and her sisters, but none seemed to cheer her up, apart from the puppet show that a strange puppeteer presented for them. How lifelike the puppets seemed! How clever they were! The acrobat could do almost anything. The king and his daughters were very amused, all except Pabhavati. The king was so pleased with the show that he summoned the puppeteer personally to congratulate him on his skill. The puppeteer was none other than Kusa, and when Pabhavati saw him, a look of disdain crossed her face. Kusa saw that contemptuous expression, and his heart sank. There is truly no hope for me, he thought. She finds me so ugly, I don't believe she will ever love me. He decided to return home there and then, without trying to see Pabhavati ever again. Suddenly, 2 messengers rushed past him and hastened into the king's council chamber. All was not well in the kingdom of Madda, and Kusa determined to find out what the trouble was. The news could not be worse. 3 kings from neighbouring kingdoms, hearing of Pabhavati's beauty, had invaded Madda. Each one demanded her hand in marriage, and each one threatened that if she did not marry him, he would attack the kingdom. The king's councillors were furious that Pabhavati had brought this trouble upon the land, and they advised that the king should have her executed and her body hacked in 3, so that each king would thus have a share of her. Of course, the king was horrified by this cruel advice. In despair, he called upon his gods to help him, and as he spoke, Kusa entered the council chamber. "I shall save your kingdom, king," Kusa told him, "for I am none other than Prince Kusa, and although your daughter despises me, I cannot bear to have her killed. I shall defeat your enemies and save your kingdom and your daughter." The king, who loved his daughter, readily agreed to let Kusa lead his army against these kings. Kusa told the generals that they would attack quickly and take the enemy by surprise. "We shall pick each army off, one by one, before they are able to join forces and attack us." Now, although Kusa was a prince of peace, he was also a formidable soldier. He had led his own army into many victorious battles, and the generals were happy to follow him. He defeated the first king without any difficulty and took him prisoner, giving instructions that he should be sent to the king of Madda without delay. Barely drawing breath, Kusa led his army in hot pursuit against the second king. The battle they waged was long and fierce, but Kusa's love of Pabhavati made him fight like 10 men. He defeated the second army decisively and sent the king as a prisoner back to Madda. The third king, realizing that by the defeat of his allies all was lost, simply abandoned his army and ran off. Kusa, however, soon overtook him. He and his men surrounded this cowardly monarch and easily overpowered him. He too was sent as a prisoner to the court of the king of Madda. As the sun set at the end of the long day, Kusa proudly presented his royal prisoners to his father-in-law, who greeted him with great joy. But Kusa's happiness knew no bounds when Pabhavati threw herself at his feet and begged forgiveness for her selfish behavior. Kusa simply asked her gently to look at his face and see if it really was as bad as she thought. She looked at him, and instead of the loathing Kusa had once seen on her face, he saw love. The next day, Kusa generously suggested that the 3 kings he had conquered, who like him had each wanted a beautiful wife, should marry each of Pabhavati's sisters. His father-in-law readily agreed to such a wise and just solution, while the defeated kings happily concurred. While those 3 couples lived long and happily together, finally the happiness of Kusa and Pabhavati reached perfection.